Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah, today, you guys see the title of the lecture is Islamic law barbaric. Obviously, and we've all heard this misconception before in one form or the other. We've all heard some sort of responses. And usually the common responses include trying to negate that Islamic law is part of Islam, an apologetic approach, a more defeatist approach. We see some responses which are reduced to, for example, explaining the conditions required before you implement Islamic law. And what is Islamic law? And the response we're going to try to give today, inshallah, will be more well-rounded. We'll try to touch upon all of these things in order that we benefit Muslims and non-Muslims, so that we can clarify some of the misconceptions that Muslims have in regards to Islamic law, and some of the misconceptions which sincere non-Muslims have against Islamic law. So what we should not do is we should not appeal to emotions, or appeal to sentiments, or appeal to superficial arguments when dealing with any question, dealing with any argument, because the Quran itself teaches us that if you want to address any misconception, any proposition, any claim, you must do so rationally, methodologically, and systematically. And this is why we see in the Quran, especially when the Quran was challenging the false norms and false ideas in Mecca, it would respond to any argument or any claim which the polytheists or which the mushrikeen made rationally, and it would deconstruct the argument. So the methodology that I'm going to use, inshallah ta'ala, and this is a methodology used in Islamic sciences, and it's derived from the Quran. The principle is, الحكم على الشيء فرع من تصوره أي واقعه. Meaning, to appraise or judge anything, you must know its reality and you must know its nature. So, for example, suppose that Brother Majid put in front of me a particular cup, right? A cup containing some sort of fluid, some sort of liquid. And I was asked to judge or to appraise this liquid. Is it legitimate? Is it permissible or impermissible to drink? Before I can act upon it, I have to judge it or appraise it. So let's say that, for example, I found out that the composition of this liquid was alcoholic. Therefore, the liquid would be haram, correct? From an Islamic perspective. Similarly, let's say, for example, someone who belongs to the Hindu faith, a piece of meat was put in front of him, correct, at a dinner. Before he can act upon it or judge or appraise that piece of meat or that meal, he would have to know its origins, its nature. And he found out, for example, that it's cow meat, therefore he would consider it to be impermissible to eat. So similarly, before we can judge Islamic law as being barbaric or otherwise, we must know the nature and the reality of Islamic law. Waqa' al-sharia, waqa' al-hudud. That's the first thing, to know its nature. Second thing, obviously we need some sort of criteria, or some sort of standard, based on which we said such and such is halal, such and such is legitimate or illegitimate. So this is the methodology we're going to employ. However, before even going into the subject in and of itself, Islamic law, it's important to, this is what I said, these are the two requirements that we need to appraise and to answer this question, if you want to address it in line with the Quranic method. However, before I even go into this argument, before we even discuss Islamic law, it's important to understand why has this misconception, i.e. Islamic law is barbaric, why has this misconception been systematically repeated, right, and disseminated in the media, academia, and by political figures? Is this misconception the product of some sincere truth seekers, some sincere academics, or is this part of a systematic campaign by certain Western political figures to demonize Islamic law and to demonize political Islam? And it's no coincidence that this misconception is being repeated all the more after the Arab Spring and after the rise of Islamist movements in the Arab Spring. As a matter of fact, if we go back to the colonial era, the French and the British used this argument, Islamic law is barbaric, as a justification to colonize the Muslim world and to marginalize Islamic law and introduce secular law. Therefore, when we hear today many Western politicians claim that Islamic law is barbaric and we need to save the Muslims from inhumane law by giving us their liberal democracy and whatnot, we must understand that this is part of a well-planned political agenda, like I said, to demonize political Islam and to reformulate Islam so that Islam is not a political religion, rather it's a religion which is limited to spirituality. And Islamic law is not law which covers all facets of life, rather it's a law which consists of regulating the individual's relationship with the Creator. And of course, one of the intentions of this argument is to create a defeatist, apologetic Muslim, a Muslim who spends his time and his intellectual energy trying to respond to misconceptions and sugarcoat Islam so that it fits the image which the colonialist wants. So it's important, if we want to be politically aware, to address this question knowing the political agenda behind this misconception, and not to approach this question by throwing out Sharia law, but address this question by turning the tables and showing the superiority of Islam and Islamic law for the Muslim world, and for mankind, of course. Of course, this is not to say that there aren't very sincere non-Muslims, and Muslims alike, who have been affected by this misconception. However, this is not the general origin of the claim. And of course, by the way, when we say barbaric, barbaric generally refers to an Oxford dictionary as that which is primitive, رجعي, and that which is inhumane. Right? غير مطابق لفطرة الإنسان أو طبيعة الإنسان. Okay, so another important point, if we want to be rational and discuss this, is that when we talk about Islamic law and Islamic criminal law, or we talk about criminal law in any system, we are not discussing what system eliminates crime. Because at the end of the day, no political system was created for a city of saints or a city of angels. Islamic law, liberal law, communitarian or socialist law was created for a particular subject, and this is a city of man. City of man with all their negative and positive energies. So our subject is what form of criminal law or what form of legislation minimizes crime, not eliminates crime, through its ideas and through its structures. Okay, so in order to know in order for us to understand the nature of Islamic law, we're going to look at three things, inshallah. First and foremost, the origins of Islamic law, the context of Islamic law, and the functions of Islamic law. And then after which we will look at the different criteria based on which we can judge Islamic law and determine whether or not it is barbaric. So, why is it important to discuss the origins of Islamic law? First of all, the origins of any piece of legislation is the most important question which determines the legitimacy or illegitimacy of that legislation. So for example, in a democratic state, a law is considered legitimate if it is a product of the general will, of majority rule. In a liberal government, correct, a law is considered legitimate to the extent to which it protects individual liberties. And similarly, for example, for John Locke, law was considered legitimate or rational if it was the product of, or if it was based on natural law or on secular reason. Now, Islamic law is fundamentally different than any form of secular law, because Muslims believe that the origins of Islamic law does not lay in the general will, it is not a product of culture, it is not a product of a particular institution in Islam. There is no institution in Islam which produces Islamic law. And it is certainly not found in the head of the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, right? Let's not even go there. The origin of Islamic law, we believe to be, is divine revelation. Islamic law in Islam is the expression, and the manifest expression, the explicit expression of a divine will. Therefore, the origin of Islamic law are absolute. It is a product of the absolute creator. And it was expressed to us through revelation, which is expressed in the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah being the actions, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And of course, our belief that the Quran is from God is based on our rational conclusion that this book and that this revelation cannot be except from God, due to its linguistic and scientific coherence. And similarly, our belief in God is also a rational belief in God. This has implications. It's important for us to understand this, because what this means is that the very origins of Islamic law are both divine And the origins of Islamic law are rational, meaning we are not asked to blindly believe in Islamic law. We are not asked to blindly believe that such and such capital punishments are legitimate. We are only asked to do so after we believe that this revelation was from God based on rational grounds. And this is a topic in and of itself which we can discuss either in the Q&A or at an event dedicated to this topic, inshallah. And this also has another important implication. In an Islamic society or in an Islamic system, it is not man who determines what designates a crime. And it is not man who determines what is to be punished. Rather, they are prescribed. So a crime is a crime because the divine will, like God, has determined such and such to be a crime. And similarly, such and such is the punishment because the divine will has determined this to be the legitimate punishment. And this is why, for example, Professor Santinella, he's one of the leading figures in leading jurist in Western political thought, in the Western legal system. He says, "We may agree with the Muslim jurists that they teach that the fundamental rule of law is liberty. God has set a bound to human activity in order to make legitimate liberty possible for all. Without the bounds of God, liberty would degenerate into license, destroying the perpetrator himself along with the social fabric." He goes on to say, "Whatever their form, these rules tend to have the same end and the same purpose, which is the public maslahah, the public interest. Accordingly, law, divine, in its origin, with human nature, with the human as its subject matter, has no other end but the welfare of man, because it is a product of divine will." Another point about the origin of Islamic law, this is our last point in regards to Islamic law, is the fact that Islamic law deals with the nature of man as he is. Because the subject of any political system is man, correct? Because it is a system constructed to organize the affairs of man. And since Islamic law is a product of the divine will, it addresses man as he is. It is in conformity with the complex nature of man. And if one were to look at, for example, Western political thought, Western political theory, they would say that they have reached a conclusion, they have reached a period which they have called the end of philosophy, the death of man, in which they have come to conclude that the greatest mystery in Western thought is the mystery of man. That's why some of the thinkers would say that we can understand the farthest cosmos and the farthest stars, but we can not understand the nature of ourselves. This is why even Immanuel Kant, for example, says, and Immanuel Kant was one of the leading proponents and philosophers who put forth the idea that our base of knowledge should be reason and not revelation. He even says, "I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but merely as I appear to myself," i.e., knowledge of me or the human subject is limited. Whereas Islam recognizes that there are certain permanent and unchanging features in the human, in man, and in society. Therefore, Islam gives us permanent and unchanging laws to deal with these unchanging and permanent features of society and man. These constants are dealt with constant legislation, whereas other relative or temporal man-made sources of legislation or systems of legislation are constantly in flux. Okay, so in regards to the origins of Islamic law, we can conclude briefly that the origins of Islamic law are 1, rational, 2, the origins of Islamic law are divine, and 3, they are in conformity with human nature. And we said that man is the subject of any political system, therefore any political system should be in line with the nature of man and should have knowledge of the subject it is regulating and it is working with. Now, what about the context of Islamic law? What I mean by the context of Islamic law is what is the framework or the system through which Islamic law and Sharia is implemented. And this is where many Muslims also fall into error in understanding the context of Islamic law. Because some Muslims, even Islamic activists and Islamic thinkers, think that our goal is simply to implement Sharia, tahkim Sharia. However, we forget that Islam has given us a system through which we implement Sharia. And let me give you 2 examples of what happens when we try to implement Islamic law outside of its context, or when we try to take Islamic law independently of the other laws related to it. So, for example, we have Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very famous example. In Saudi Arabia, it's a monarchy, which is un-Islamic. 2, there's a monopoly over wealth, which is un-Islamic. 3, there's no distribution of wealth, which is un-Islamic. Yet, they decide to cut the hands of the thief, who steals out of necessity. For example, Saudi Arabia also, for example, claims to protect the women through hijab, yet they do not give women their basic rights. And obviously, what does this lead to? This leads to 1, a misimplementation of Islam. 2, the objectives of Islamic law are not met, right, which is mercy and justice. And 3, it leads to a misrepresentation of Islam. Another example is something we see day to day when, let's say, a Muslimah, a sister, or even a brother. I'll give a brother example so the sisters don't carry on the hudud on me after this. For example, we see some of the sisters, mashallah, from her neck and above, lillah azza wa jal, right? She has her hijab and everything. But everything below is not in conformity with Islam. What does this lead to? This leads to 1, a misapplication of the Islamic law. 2, the objectives of the hijab are not met, i.e. modesty. And 3, this leads to a negative representation of Islam. Because when Allah obligated the hijab, He also obligated a particular set of relations. The sister has to act, and the brother, they have to act in a certain way with the opposite gender and with the same sex, the same gender. Islam also, for example, obligated that she should be in a particular state of mind, a state of God consciousness. She should speak in a certain way. She should interact with society in a particular way. It's a whole lifestyle, right? Beginning with the consciousness towards the outer appearance. And of course, the dress code, of which hijab is one part, is also what? It goes from the head to the toe. It's not just something from the neck and above. So when this sister decided to implement one part of the Islamic subsystem of modesty, this led to immodesty and a negative representation of Islam. Similarly, for example, some of the brothers, and we encounter some of these brothers, you see, mashallah, praying 5 times a day in the masjid, praying fajr in the masjid and whatnot. But when you come to speak to him, he's very rude, or he has this very strong personality, and he's not friendly. Even though the very same reason we pray, our prayer is part of this individual system which Islam sent to cultivate the ideal individual, the friendly, the Islamic personality. Yet we see that this brother took one part of these individual commandments and left the rest. What did this lead to? Again, a misrepresentation of Islam. The same thing can be said about Islamic law and Sharia law. If you want to implement Islam, politically implement it all. Otherwise, don't implement it, or else this will lead to a misapplication of Islam. So, what is the context of Islamic law? What is the political framework through which we implement Sharia and through which we implement the criminal system, the criminal legislation in Islam? First and foremost, the penal laws in Islam, the criminal laws, are part of Islamic law, and we say that Islamic law covers all facets of life, from the individual to the family, to the political, to the academic, and so forth. Therefore, for me to say, for example, Islamic law, or the hudud, is similar to me saying that the law in the US is a death penalty in Texas. Doesn't make any sense. It's a reductive fallacy. That's one. 2, the Islamic law, and this is when it's... and for an example of trying to reduce Sharia law to the hudud, or to the criminal law, it is similar to me saying that the laws in the United States, or the US Constitution, can be understood by looking at the death penalty in Texas, which is capital punishment. Whereas the scope of law is obviously much wider than that of capital punishments and so forth. That's the first point about Islamic law. Islamic law should not be reduced to the hudud. It is comprehensive law which covers all facets of life. 2, Islamic law is implemented within a distinct political system. And this system is called the Khilafah, the Caliphate system. This system has an economic, political, and social dimension. The head of this system, and this is an interesting point, which the media tends to overlook, and which Muslims tend to overlook, especially the despotic leaders in the Muslim world, that those in power in the Muslim Khilaf, in the Muslim Caliphate, in the Islamic State, were brought to power by Islamic society. So within the Caliphate system, it is the Islamic society, it is the people, Muslims and non-Muslims, who adhere to a particular set of values, who adhere to Islamic values, who adhere to these universal principles, they elect representatives and they elect a political figure for two reasons. One, to protect them, right? To provide protection for the state, and two, to implement Islamic law. Therefore, in an Islamic state which is implementing the hudud, it is the people who elected officials to implement the hudud. This is why in the Quran, when Allah is saying, for example, and cut the hands of the thief, or and flog the wrongdoers, or flog the adulterer and the adulteress, it comes in the plural form. فَقْطَعُوا. It's speaking to the jama'ah, it's speaking to the community. But of course, since the community in and of itself cannot carry out this function, it must elect an official, a representative to do so. Otherwise, we would have anarchy. So those who are implementing Islamic law on society is society. And this is long before the notion of elections and representation emerged in Italy in the 16th century, or the idea of modern democracy emerged. This was at the time. This was in Medina. These are based on verses revealed in Medina. Okay. What about the economic dimension of the Khilafah? The economic dimension of the Islamic state. And obviously this is also in contradistinction to what we see today, right? Where some of the richest people in the world are these Arab tyrants, these Arab despots. The economic dimension of the Khilafah is based on a distributive policy. One, it's based on a distribution of wealth, and two, it's based on a system of anti-monopoly. Meaning within the Islamic Khilafah, within the Caliphate state, natural resources such as water, grain, minerals, and things like that are public property. These are public property. They cannot steal and so forth. These cannot be monopolized by any corporation, right? Or by the state itself. And as I said, there's a system of distribution. It is the duty of society in the Islamic system, and there's a historical testimony to this. It is the duty of the Islamic political system to meet the minimal needs of those in society. And we will see why this is important when we talk about some of the punishments, such as some of the hudud, for example, cutting the hand of the thief and so forth. We're beginning to see the context of these laws. Similarly, for example, the Islamic society, or the Islamic state, is also based on an Islamic society. Why? Because it was the Islamic society which elected its officials to begin with. The Islamic society is a society which has internalized these principles, which has internalized revelation, and it has become the values and customs which regulate their lives. Therefore, Islamic law is not merely a set of laws which are implemented by the state. It is a set of laws and cultural norms which become part of the social fabric of that society, right? And it becomes part of the God consciousness of that society. It becomes part of a society which believes that these laws are just because they're based on divine will. Now, why is this important? Why is it important for us to look at to have a social system, right? Before we speak of the criminal laws. There was a study done at the New Brunswick University, and one of the conclusions that they reached about the prison system was, despite the creation of in-reach teams in prisons to treat the mentally disordered prisoners, or those wrongdoers or those criminals, the Mental Health Commission last year warned the prison community cannot offer any real equivalent to the support and care available outside prison. In other words, that which breeds the criminal or prevents the breeding of a criminal is essentially the social system and not the coercive state apparatus or the coercive laws or the police or something of that sort, or the criminal system. As a matter of fact, if we know anything about the criminal law in the West, it's that it's largely failing, and the prison system or the prison environment tends to create even worse criminals. It's become a culture. It's actually even become something in the media, right? This criminal culture system. You know, you roll the movie The Godfather, and what's that one, with the gun?
Scarface.
I'm sorry? Scarface, thank you, exactly. Yeah, and so forth. So, inshallah, just to conclude this point about the context of Islamic law. So we see that the penal laws in Islam, or the criminal laws in Islam, are part of a harmonious system, all of which are interdependent, not independent. These laws are interdependent and complementary. Implementing one part of the system and not the other leads to a misimplementation. and so forth. Or else, misimplementation also leads to an arbitrary implementation of Islamic law. Therefore, again, when we speak about the context of Islamic law, Sharia law is not to be implemented by a warlord or by a king. It's to be implemented by a caliph who is elected by the people to regulate the affairs of the people according to Islamic law, and so forth. And Muhammad Asad, he's a leading Islamic figure, leading Islamic thinker, and a Jewish convert to Islam. So he was asked, why did you embrace, he put it very nicely, he was asked, why did you embrace Islam? What was it that attracted you in particular? So he says, and I must confess that I do not have any single satisfactory answer. It was not any particular teaching that attracted me to Islam, but it was the whole wonderful, inexplicably coherent structure of moral teaching and practical life program. I could not say, even now, what aspects of it appeal most to me, any other. Islam appears to me like a perfect work of architecture. All of its parts are harmoniously conceived to complement and support each other. Nothing is superfluous, right? Nothing is exceeding, and nothing is lacking. And as a result, it is a structure of absolute balance and solid composure. So let's give a more specific example. In the absence of an Islamic economic system, in the absence of distribution, the Islamic laws for theft, for example, are not implemented. You cannot cut the hands of the thief if the state is not meeting the needs and the minimum needs required from that thief, correct? Such as his physiological needs, even his emotional needs such as marriage and so forth, relationships and whatnot. Similarly, Islam, for example, does not punish sexual deviancy unless there is an Islamic social system in place. So, unlike other systems, Islam does not promote sexploitation, the utilization of women in media, a growing pornography industry on one hand, and on the other punish rape, right? For example, Islamic law does not exploit the wealth of the lower classes or monopolize money and monopolize wealth and so forth, and on the other hand, punish theft. No, Islamic law makes sure that all those internal and external factors which lead to a conducive society are in place before it implements Islamic law, or before it implements the criminal laws in Islam, which we will discuss inshallah. And in order, if you want to understand what is the spirit, the general spirit of the Islamic system, it's sufficient just to look at the objective of the Islamic society, Islam's objective towards society. We see that Islam's objective towards society is to create a sacred space. The public domain is a sacred space, in the same way the private domain is a sacred space. Whereas Western political theory is based on the idea and on the objective of creating a secular space. A space which is divorced of morality and of any what they call comprehensive doctrines or any religious faiths of things of that sort. So to conclude this part, this shows us that Islam, and this is a point for the Muslims, more so than the non-Muslims, because unfortunately this has gone unseen, that Islam does not just give us a set of ideas, but it gives us the practical method by which we can realize and actualize these ideas. And implementing the hudud, implementing, for example, cutting the hands of the thief and flogging the adulteress and so forth, it comes from the same misunderstanding of Islamic law. It comes from the misunderstanding that we can implement the method without implementing the idea. And we can implement Sharia law without having a caliphate system. Or we can, for example, implement the punishment of cutting the hand of the thief without having an Islamic economic system in place. And this is why we say Islam fiqra wa tariqa. Another point, inshallah, I promise is the last point about context. Many people tend to ignore the conditions put on the Islamic criminal system. Meaning, what are the conditions which must be in place or must be present before you can cut the hands of the thief, or before you can carry out the capital punishment against the adulterer and the adulteress. For example, the thief. First and foremost, as we said, the first condition is that there is a just distributed Islamic system in place. 2, the thief did not steal out of hunger or necessity, meaning he did not steal food, blankets, or anything of that sort. 3, the thief stole above a certain amount, meaning if someone were to steal, for example, a folder from Mannix or a sandwich from or something like that, so his hand would not be cut, obviously. There's a certain amount, there's a certain value above which the object which the thief stole must weigh. For example, gold, money, something of that sort. Furthermore, the thief could not have stolen, obviously out of mental illness, or he could not have stolen from his own domain, from his family, or from his relatives, or something of that sort. So all of these conditions have to be in place before the implementation of that law can be set forth. For example, let's say, and to take it even further, let's say that a particular employee stole from his employer. Doesn't matter how much he stole. Let's say the value of what he stole exceeds that ceiling set by Sharia, i.e., it's valuable enough for him to have his hand cut, correct? And the judge figures out, or it's brought to his awareness that his employer, his boss, was not giving him his salary. He was not fulfilling the needs of that employee who stole. Similarly, who would be the one punished? The employer, correct? And not the employee. And so forth. For example, the infamous capital punishment which is implemented on the adulterer and the adulteress. The capital punishment meaning death. So, if anyone were to, for example, have sexual relations outside of bounds of marriage, the punishment for which, if you are married, is death. If you are not married, is flogging in Islamic law. But what are the conditions? We all know this, right? What are the conditions for implementing this law? One, there's an Islamic social system in place. Two, as we said, if it's capital punishment, right, that person must have been married. So, for example, that person was married and he had an outlet or a channel through which he can satisfy his sexual relation or his sexual needs, but he decided to do so deviantly, right? And, for example, even if you look at the marriage system in Islam, if one of the two partners in Islam the sexual needs are not being satisfied, that person has the right to go to the judge in an Islamic state and get a divorce. Imagine to this extent. Furthermore, for example, Islam dictates that if you are to marry someone, it must be done out of choice. There are no forced marriages in Islam. So, before the Islamic law of capital punishment is carried out, i.e. the execution of the adulterer or the adulteress, the judge must be certain of several things. One, there's a social system in place which promotes modesty and so forth. Two, this person was married yet decided to go outside the bounds of marriage. Three, and this is the most strict condition, is that there must be 4 witnesses who witness the act of the sexual act. And this does not refer to a man and a woman, for example, in bed, making out or something of that sort. It refers to the actual act of sexual penetration. 4 witnesses must witness this act taking place. All of them have to be trustworthy. All of them must give the same testimony, and all of them must willingly go to the court and say, we witnessed such and such carrying out the sexual act with such and such at this time and in this day, and this is exactly what they were doing. So again, this relates to, and this helps us understand what is the real function of these Islamic laws. And it's sufficient to look historically how many times this punishment was carried out. The Islamic punishment of the Islamic capital punishment for the adulterer and the adulteress, and even for the thief, cutting the hand of the thief. And this is testified even by Western Orientalists who came to the Muslim world, right, before the colonial era, to demonize Islam. If you go back and read their historical testimonies, they testify and they are witnesses to the fact that these punishments are rarely carried out. Now, this brings us to the third point, inshallah. The functions of Islamic law. What is the function of these punishments in particular, in specific? First and foremost, it's important that we discuss, well, what are the objectives of Islamic law? Al-maqasid, correct? 1. The first objective of Islamic law is the preservation of life. 2. The preservation of religion. 3. The preservation of reason. 4. The preservation of lineage. And 5. The preservation of property. So, for example, how does Islam meet these 5 universal needs? To preserve life, it prescribes the law of retribution. If you kill, you are killed. You get killed. This is the punishment for killing someone in Islam. is being executed. To preserve reason, Islam has certain punishments for drinking, right, if you are a Muslim. And to preserve property, Islam has certain laws and punishment for theft. And this is why Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, when He's talking about the philosophy and the objective of Islamic law, He says, and surely there is for you in legal retribution fil qisas hayat, and there is for you in legal retribution life, O people of understanding, so that you may be righteous. Okay, now what are the we spoke about objectives. What are the functions of Islamic law? Wadifat al-hudud wa wadifat al-sharia islamiyya. First and foremost, the general function of Islamic law is the positive orientation of our needs. Right? We all have certain physiological and emotional needs, whether it's hunger, thirst, sexual needs, emotional needs, for example, the need for companionship and so forth. As humans, right, who have reason, it's not sufficient that we satisfy these needs, but there must be a particular way or method in which we satisfy them. Correct? So, for example, there must be a particular way in which we satisfy our desire or organic need to eat, our organic need to satisfy our desires, our organic need for companionship, and so forth. So the goal of Islamic law and the function of the Sharia is تنظيم هذه الحاجات والغرائز, is the organization and the regulation of these organic needs of man, so that these natural impulses are not animalistic, but rather they're humane and positive. They're channeled positively for the sake of that individual and for the greater good of society. So, for example, if we were to look at the satisfaction, and I use this example because the most infamous capital punishment is the capital punishment against the adulterer and adulteress, i.e. death. For example, the satisfaction of sexual needs. Islam begins by providing laws which relate to the individual. It cultivates, right, through its laws, a God-conscious individual. 1. 2. Islamic law cultivates a harmonious system, a harmonious family, right? A sacred private sphere. And it does so by putting very strict conditions on marriage, as I noted earlier. For example, the man and the wife must marry based on consent. They cannot be forced into a marriage. They must marry based on certain emotional attachment or social emotional inclination, and the other conditions put forth by the Prophet Muhammad. Islamic law. Islam goes even further. Islamic law in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad even regulate and even advise the husband and the wife on how to sexually satisfy your husband and how to sexually satisfy your wife, right? And then of course there's a social system, right, which regulates the behaviors of the individuals, and which is based on certain laws in regards to segregation, which, for example, deter or prohibit the sexploitation or the utilization of women in media. And for one to look, for example, if Pepsi or any sort of product were to advertise, right, in the media, it would immediately resort to what? A utilization of women. And this leads to sexual deviancy because of the environment, the internal and external factors and environment which is being created in society, which are conducive towards committing crime. Whereas through Islamic law, these needs and impulses are regulated in a way which leads to a positive and productive satisfaction of these needs. Okay, so this is, I think, the part where what we were waiting for. What about the function of the hudud? What about the function of the criminal laws in Islam? First and foremost, what is the scope of criminal laws in Islam? Can the state punish any sort of crime? No. The authority of the political heads in the Islamic State, or the authority of those in power, is the public domain. Therefore, whatever crimes you commit in the private domain or within the confines of your house, the state is not allowed to intervene in such. As a matter of fact, it's prohibited in Islam to spy or to try to regulate the private domain. Even if, let's say, the police force in the Islamic State, or even the caliph himself, the head of state himself, witnessed a crime being carried out inside the private domain, he's not allowed to punish them for doing so, because he committed a crime himself by spying on his citizens. So 1, they're public. 2, not all Islamic laws in the not all Islamic criminal laws are hudud. you have three types of punishments in Islam: al-hudud, al-qisas, wal-ta'zir. Okay, al-hudud, al-qisas are prescribed punishments, meaning they're fixed, they were set forth, and they were designated by God. And these are the capital punishments. These are found in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Whereas al-ta'zir refers to those punishments or those crimes which the Quran did not address, which are contemporary crimes or contemporary issues. These are left to the discretion of the judge, and he determines the adequate crime and so forth. Okay, so and obviously the point of controversy is over al-hudud wal-qisas. So what is the function of al-hudud and al-qisas? Ernest van der Haag, he's a professor at Fordham University, he's also a leading political jurist. He says, what is feared the most deters the most. In other words, the function of al-hudud and al-qisas in Islam is deterrence, al-zajr, right? To deter criminals from that crime. Why? Let's examine this more carefully. Let's examine this more specifically. A thief, correct, steals based on particular psychological motives. And this psychological motive is increasing his possessions. However, the opposite of increasing your possession is decreasing your possession, such as losing the most vital and intimate material object to you possessed in your hand. Therefore, based on the same, and that's why in Islam, the punishment prescribed for stealing, i.e. one who seeks to increase his possessions, is a punishment which leads to the decreasing of his possessions. Correct? So that Islam provides a deterrence based on the same psychological motives which push the criminal to commit that crime in the very beginning. For example, sexual deviancy or sex out of marriage or something of that sort. The original psychological motive for such is what? Pleasure. What's the opposite of pleasure?
Pain.
Pain. So then what's the prescription, what's the punishment for sexual deviancy? What's the means of deterrence? Exactly, pain. And likewise. So basically, the Islamic hudud or the Islamic qisas deter the crime based on the very same psychological motives which provide the original impulse for the criminal. This is why, for example, Thomas Hobbes, he's also one of the founding fathers of Western political theory, says the punishment for a crime must be greater than the benefit that comes from committing the crime. Let me repeat. The punishment for a crime must be greater than the benefit that comes from committing the crime. Similarly, another leading political thinker, Cesare de Cara, he's an Italian jurist, and he's the author of a very famous treaty, very famous book which is used today in Western legal theory called On Crimes and Punishments, written in 1764. He says, since people are rationally self-interested, they will not commit crimes if the cost of committing crime prevails over the benefits of engaging in undesirable acts. Repeat. Since people are rationally self-interested, they will not commit crimes if the cost of committing crimes prevail over the benefits engaging in that crime. This is why he also says it is better to prevent crime than to punish them. Similarly, Jeremy Bentham, another leading and founding father of Western political theory and the father of the utilitarian school, says that all punishments are evil, because obviously he views that all law is man-made law. All punishment is mischief. However, he maintained also that all penalties, all punishments are evil unless the punishment is used to avert greater evil or to control the action of offenders. So Jeremy Bentham made it very clear when he was elucidating his understanding of legislation that any crime, any penalty is evil unless the function or the objective of that crime is to prevent crime and not just to punish the criminal for the sake of punishing the criminal. Now, there's obviously an important question. What about prison? Do prisons deter crime? According to a report carried out by the New Brunswick University and the University of Cincinnati, and this was carried out by Claire Goggin, right? And the name of this report, which we can provide, inshallah, is called "The Effects of Prison Sentences." They said that some of the conclusions were: prisons should not be used with the expectation of reducing criminal behavior. 2, on the basis of the present results, excessive use of incarceration, right, imprisonment, has enormous cost implications. 3, in order to determine who is being adversely affected by prison, it is incumbent upon prison officials to obviously employ alternative means of rehabilitating the criminals. So the general conclusion of this result, of this study on the prison system, was that 1, it does not deter crime. 2, it does not rehabilitate the prisoner, but rather it provides them an environment even worse, right, the prison environment, which leads to a further dehumanization and demoralization of the criminal. Furthermore, because the one of the other end goals or functions of the deterrence of Islamic law is that it prevents these crimes from being normalized in society. And this is why, for example, Aristotle noted that a bad man can do 1,000,000 times more harm than a beast. And this is also why the Quran dictates in regards to the punishment. The Quran says a group of believers should witness the punishment. In other words, the punishment should be carried out, what? Publicly. So this brings me to the final part of the talk, inshallah, which is based on, now that we understand the origins, the context, and the functions of Islamic law, i.e. we have understood the nature and the reality of Islamic law, on what grounds or on what basis can we say that it is barbaric? Obviously, we cannot do so based on revelation, because revelation, whether it's Quranic revelation or whether it's pre-Islamic revelation, such as the Old Testament prescribes the very same punishment, if not more severe. So what are we left with? What about science? Does science point to the fact that these laws are barbaric? First and foremost, science is amoral, meaning science does not tell us what is morally correct and morally wrong. As a matter of fact, some of the most important political values which we hold on to, such as equality, cannot be defended by science. This is why Louis Pojman says that if we were to accept the empirical reality of people and the differences, there should be a presumption of inequality rather than a presumption of equality. Furthermore, science tells us what we can do, does not tell us what we should do. For example, science tells us that we have the medical technology to carry out abortions. Science tells us that we have the technology needed to create atomic bombs. But science does not tell us if we should carry out abortion, if we should drop atomic bomb. Meaning it tells us what we can do. And even if I was to entertain this argument that based on science, we can know whether Sharia is moral or immoral. There's a tool used in science which is called a trial and error method. Trial and error. For example, you try different systems and different methods until you conclude that which is best or most productive towards meeting your objective. And as we saw earlier, based on the trial and error method, we can conclude that the Western penal system has obviously failed, if not created worsening conditions for crime. Therefore, based on the very same modalities and tools used by science, i.e. the trial and error method, it points to the opposite of Islamic law being inhumane and primitive. If anything, it is an advanced and futuristic model for both the Muslim world and the West. What about secular reason? What about reason? Someone can argue, based on my own reason, I would argue that Islamic law is barbaric. First and foremost, reason is subjective. This is why there are differences on the most basic values. For example, what does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to be equal? What does it mean to be free? What are the scopes of freedom? What does it mean to tolerate? What does it mean to be intolerant? And so forth. So, reason is subjective. It does not provide a grounding based on which you can say such and such is moral or amoral. Furthermore, knowledge is not neutral. It's not neutral. It's always the expression. For example, any legislation based on reason will be the expression of someone's will being imposed on another person's will. Correct? Because like we said, there's no universal reason which can reach universal moral conclusions. And of course, there are other arguments made by liberals like John Rawls and so forth, but we can discuss this in the Q&A, inshallah, more if you want to discuss secular reason and whatnot. Because based on the very same argument of reason, if we as Muslims wanted to put forth rational and reasonable arguments for carrying out the hudud and the qisas, we can do so. based on the very same values which secular liberal societies use. For example, the overriding value of the individual, the overriding value of modesty, the overriding value of society, and so forth. So we can resort to the same values used by liberals to justify the hudud. Why? Like I said, because reason is subjective. And what about the utility of law? I.e., the extent to which law is effective, increases pleasure and decreases pain. As I said, when we understand Islamic law as being a means of deterrence as opposed to a means of solely punishing the criminal for the sake of punishing the criminal, and when we look at the historical effectiveness of the Islamic law, we can conclude based on the grounds of utility, which is also a secular principle used in the West and founded largely by Jeremy Bentham, that the utility lays in the Islamic penal system and not otherwise. And this, inshallah, concludes the body of the talk. And like I said, we went over the different points briefly, but inshallah, we can go into more detail in the Q&A on one of the dimensions discussed. And that's it. Jazakumullah khair. If you have any questions, inshallah, we can begin.
I had a question that popped into my head when you were talking about Islam does not interfere with the private sphere. Okay? So Islam does not, somebody says, okay, you have the question of maybe a husband who's beating his wife.
Yes.
She's so psychologically damaged, she doesn't go to the judge and complain. How does Islam treat this kind of?
First of all, what I said was that the Islamic political authority, right, cannot intervene and cannot, the Islamic state, the political authority, i.e. the executive, those in power, cannot regulate the private sphere, whereas Islam does, because Islam is a comprehensive religion. And to say that Islam has nothing to do with the private sphere, it's like the opposite of secularism, right? That's one. Two, there are certain cases in which the body, or in which those in authority in Islam, this has been explained in detail by Islamic jurists, can intervene into the private sphere when there is, when the man or the wife transgresses against the rights of the other, and those rights are designated in the Quran and in the Sunnah. So where there is a violation of these rights, the rights between man and women, or the conflict between man and women, the Islamic authority can intervene. But the point was that, and this is the same in liberal societies, even societies which believe that there must be a complete separation of the private domain and the public domain, they interfere in cases of domestic abuse. What I meant was, and this is the ultimate point, that the Islamic state cannot spy, right, or cannot forcibly regulate the private domain, or otherwise it would be a totalitarian state and a dictatorship state. But of course there are cases in which the Caliph and the Qadi are obligated to intervene, even when this relates to things such as the wife not having her needs met, whether this is emotionally or physically and so forth. But the right to intervene is designated in Islam. It's designated in Revelation. So it's not up to the judge, for example, to decide, you know what, I'm going to visit so-and-so because there might have been a transgression, or I consider this to be a transgression. Those cases in which the Islamic authority can intervene in the public sphere are already designated by Islamic law, and they're not arbitrary. And of course, there is a punishment in Islam. There is a punishment, a public punishment in Islam for the abuse of the wife, or the abuse of, or the other way around. Because in today's society, mashallah, you
said when it comes to economic systems, the Islamic state has to follow a distributive policy.
Yeah.
Do you mean to go so far as to say that what Islam prescribes is sort of communism or socialism?
Within the Islamic system, that which is public are only natural resources. So there is private property in the Islamic state.
Okay.
Therefore, we cannot say it is communist. It's similar to the communist system. There is a balance between public resources, right, which are publicly owned by the people who are in authority, and then there's private property, which belongs to individuals or is part of investing or something of that sort. And the distributive policy in Islam, similarly, is not based on a one-party system, as in the socialist system. It can be based on a multi-party system, right, which is executive and which is elected by the people. So this also makes it different than the socialist system. But the Islamic policy for distribution has been in place since the first Islamic state was set up in Medina, and it was carried forth up until the Islamic State was demolished in 1924. Any other questions?
I have another question. You didn't mention apostasy.
Very good question.
Yeah.
Okay. First and foremost, apostasy in Islam, it becomes a crime when it's a public act, and it's an act which is disturbing the social fabric or the political architecture of the state. In other words, when apostasy becomes an act of treason against society and goes in authority, right? That's when it becomes a crime, and that's when it becomes a capital punishment. Whereas, for example, if apostasy is not done as an act of treason, it is not done through an act of enmity towards the state, and it is done through rational dialogue and debate and so forth, then obviously the punishment would not be capital punishment. This is why even in Medina, a man came to the Prophet Muhammad and apostated and then walked away. So the Prophet did not carry out the act of the capital punishment upon him. But in the same context, in Medina, you had this campaign which a certain tribe concocted, which was that they would all convert to Islam, they would all leave Islam at once. And this story is mentioned historically in the Islamic history books. So the goal behind this mass apostasy was to create social disturbance and whatnot, and to lead to a normalization of apostasy. And so this is when the Prophet carried out the act of the capital punishment on apostasy. So similarly, apostasy has a particular context it must take place under before the capital punishment can be carried out.
So in countries like Iran and Sudan and Saudi Arabia, they're unfairly prosecuting people
Of course. That's why I said that's why I said in the very beginning that the origins of Islamic law we believe to be divine revelation. Whereas states such as Iran and Saudi Arabia and Sudan, which take certain parts of Islam which meet their political interests and leave others, this is obviously implementation of Islam, and these are illegitimate regimes. They're completely illegitimate to the extent which, and I'll say openly, alhamdulillah, they should be overthrown because they're illegitimate rulers who are not implementing Islamic law in its totality. Rather, they're doing harm to Islamic law and utilizing Islamic law and instrumentalizing Islam for their own political interests. And what is all the more unfortunate is that you have some religious figures which try to defend them, and which we call palace scholars. However, obviously, our goal towards them is that critique and to expose their discourse and whatnot. Any other questions from the sisters?
Could it be any way where the Sharia, the Islamic law, be applied to a society, but also contemplate the idea that other religions or other things live together? So, I don't know.
I was actually expecting you, waiting for you to ask this question. What about Islamic law and non-Muslims? Because we said in the very beginning that Islamic law is implemented on, we believe that Islamic law has divine origins. So when Islamic law is being implemented upon a Muslim, he knows that the origin of this law is divine. And similarly, he knows that he is the one in authority, and he is the one who elected the caliph to implement these laws upon him. Okay, what about the non-Muslim who does not believe that these laws are divine? The Islamic system provides a system of autonomy for the non-Muslims. In other words, within the Islamic State, Christians, Jews, and people of other faith are given legal and administrative autonomy to judge by their own laws and their own courts. Therefore, in Islamic system, a Christian will not be punished for drinking or eating pork. Similarly, a Christian who carries out, for example, sexual deviancy or sex outside the bounds of marriage is not punished according to the same punishments which are prescribed in the Quran. He is punished according to his own religion, according to his own courts. And as a matter of fact, it is actually the duty and one of the functions of the Islamic system, I'll show you inshallah, is one of the duties of the Islamic system to protect these courts and to protect these non-Muslim communities which are given full judicial and administrative autonomy. And as a matter, this is, for example, one of the okay, you can't read it, never mind. Well, anyway, I'll tell you the context, inshallah. Not because I read it, but I can't read that. but I had a copy of it. For example, when the Christians came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, from the tribe of Najran, and they told them that we want to be part of the Muslim community. So the Prophet made it very clear that 1, they are given legal and judicial autonomy. 2, they are protected from any sort of external danger, whether this is a Muslim army, whether this is a Muslim militia who decides to start killing Christians and Jews, or whether this is an external enemy, like an invasion or occupation. 3, they do not have to serve in the Muslim army. Rather, they can live within the confines or within the Muslim community, but they are not obligated to fight on their own behalf. It is a Muslim community which must defend the Christians. And defending the Christians refers to defending their property, defending their churches, and defending their courts. Furthermore, and even more so, Muslims are obligated to also spend on non-Muslims whose minimal needs are not met. So for example, if that Christian community, that Jewish community, that Hindu community or so forth does not have it, cannot fulfill the needs of, for example, the women and the elderly in that society, the Islamic distributive system must do so. So Islam provides all the positive aspects of the Islamic system to non-Muslims without them having to resort to our courts, because, like I said, Islam does not enforce a law on you which you do not believe in to begin with. You do not believe in the origins of that law. Therefore, لا إكراه في الدين. There is no compulsion in religion.
Historically, these non-Muslim communities had to pay a special tax.
Exactly.
Is that Islamic or not?
The jizya is paid by. The jizya is paid in return for not being obligated to fight within the army. So, for example, if a non-Muslim said, and by the way, the jizya is only given to non-Muslim males, adults, within a certain age period. And the scholars differ, for example, between 18 and 35 and so forth. So, for example, if you decide to fight in the Muslim army or in the state's army, you don't have to pay the jizya. And this is why at the time of the Prophet, at the time of the other caliphs, some tribes would say, listen, we don't want to pay the jizya, we want to serve in the army, and they're allowed to do so. Furthermore, if they decided not to serve in the army, right, and pay the jizya, which is a tax needed in order to be able to fund the army and to fund the distribution of wealth and to fund public services, let's say the Muslim army could not protect the non-Muslims, it would return the jizya to them. It would return their money. This has happened historically when the Christians were invading, when the Crusaders were invading Syria, and the army was too large for the Muslims to repel. So the leader of the Muslim army at that time, Abu Ubaidah, returned the jizya and returned the money to the non-Muslims, saying that we have not fulfilled our duty to you, therefore you have no need to fulfill your duty towards us, i.e. paying a 2.5% tax, which is compared to the tax of today's capitalist system is nothing. So again, jizya is given in, as a substitute for serving in the army, which you're free to do if you would like to do so.
It's also nothing compared to zakat.
Exactly, exactly. And like I said, this tax is universal. It's also paid by the Muslims through their income, their property, and so forth. So the tax paid by the non-Muslims is much less than that paid by the Muslims. Any questions?
Yeah, I have another question. Because maybe it's a very Western thought, but I think this idea of barbarian when looking at the Islamic law comes because of like in the Middle Age, in Europe, there's also this idea of having kinds of eyes or knives in case that they are crimes. But could be a modern way of understanding these punishments. I mean, like for example, someone that commits a robbery or a thief stole a lot of money from a big company. Like some of the president of the company steals a lot of money from for a politician. Could it understood as not tracking fiscally them, like for example, not allowing him to have any more money than what he needs for eating or something like that? I don't know. Some way that doesn't need to be a critical person or that would be like go so far.
This is a very good question. Let me just first clarify something. That there's no discrimination when implementing the Islamic criminal laws, because you mentioned, for example, someone, the head of a company and so forth. This is why the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, Wallahi, law Fatima bint Muhammad saraqat laqata'tu yadayha. I swear by Allah, had my daughter Fatima bint Muhammad stolen, I would have cut her hand. And there are many cases of this in Islamic society where the heads of state were punished. Therefore, in an Islamic state, for example, if the CEO of a particular company was accused of theft and he was brought to court and tried and the accusation was proven true, he would be given the same punishment as any citizen of that society, even from the lower class. Even though, like Islam tries to minimize the class gaps. Whereas in regards to whether it's modern or not, this has to do with something, we have to understand something about the nature of man. That man's nature does not necessarily change with time. There are certain features in man which are permanent and unchanging, whether it's 3,000 years ago or now. Therefore, Islamic law gave us legislation which is unchanging and permanent to deal with these unchanging and permanent dimensions and aspects of man. And this is why, for example, the hudud and the capital punishment in Islam are fixed, right? They're not changed by the change of time. And this is what we see, for example, in secular societies. Therefore, Islam is modern in that it is able to address man as he is in all times and in all places. It's universal and timeless. What you said about, do we understand the law to be literal or do we understand it to be metaphorical? First of all, we will understand it to be literal because it was explicitly stated in the Quran, فَقْطَعُ. It explicitly says, cut the hands of the thief. And actually the function of this is to deter him from stealing, to deter him from committing the crime. Whereas had the punishment been something otherwise, it would no longer be a means of deterrence, it would simply be a punishment for the sake of being a punishment. And it would lose its original objective. So this is why we take the hukum, the legislation, to be literal because it was expressed as such in the Quran. And we obviously, after we concluded that this book does have divine origins, we submit logically and rationally to that which is in this book, including all the legislation, including the hudud and the qisas. So again, if we were to take some people call the spirit of the law as opposed to the letters of the law, it would no longer be a means of deterrence. And then we would have to resort to the very same crumbling and failing prison system which others have tried and has failed. Did this answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So basically there is no prison system.
Okay. And like I said, there's 3 forms of laws in Islam. 3 forms of punishment. There's the hudud and the qisas, right? And these are designated in the Quran and the Sunnah, and these are the capital punishments. Then there's those crimes which are not mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, certain modern crimes. So for example, let's say for example stem cell research was forbidden. Right? Islam did not discuss, the Quran did not mention stem cell research. Therefore it would be through the discretion of the judge to determine a crime, and he can, for example, designate prison system. Because Umar ibn Khattab introduced the prison system, but for those crimes which were not already mentioned in the Quran, into which you cannot use a means of deterrence. So for example, it would be more suitable to keep this person isolated from society, therefore you can use a prison system. So it is only with the 3rd types of punishments in Islam, which are not mentioned by the Quran and the Sunnah, which is at-ta'zir, which we can employ any punishment within the bounds of Islam, of course. They cannot be too harsh or too excessive. And like I said, this is why there were prison systems in Islam, but they were only used for specific purposes. They were not used as a means of deterrence. They are used merely to isolate individuals from society, and they're not used to rehabilitate individuals, because we have seen that you cannot rehabilitate an individual through a criminal, through the prison environment.
Do you have any examples?
Throughout Islamic history, at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, he introduced the prison system up until the Ottoman Empire. There were prison systems in place.
But for like what kind of crimes? I'm just curious if you can mention something.
Sometimes preparing
For
for
example?
fasting.
I'm sorry?
Some prisons we just, if someone's not fasting during Ramadan, this is the right thing, and if it's not
For example, like yes, for example, openly, propagating or encouraging not fasting or not praying.
just as a kind of, to be an example for others, not to just...
Not to commit that same crime. And there's many examples because it's within the legal records of 1300 years of Islamic, the present Islamic system. So there's numerous cases in which they went to the Qadi. And especially, for example, ta'zir is usually used as well when you have a Muslim and a non-Muslim in a particular case. So what do we judge by? Do we judge by the Islamic law, or do we judge the Christian by his law? So this is also where ta'zir comes in place. Any other questions from the sisters?
I have a question about the cutting the thief's hands, and you said it was specifically that punishment because it is deterrence for the actual crime. But why couldn't, but that would make him physically unable to actually steal anything else, right?
Yes.
Why wouldn't putting him in jail, which is away from prison and away from anything that he might steal, sort of a way of also deterrence from the same crime without mutilating or without physically harming the thief?
It's a very good question. First, I think the introduction of the penal system in the prison system in the West as early as the 16th century up until now testifies to the fact that it does not deter crime. As a matter of fact, there's a study by the University of Chicago. It's titled "The Inefficiency of Prison as a Deterrence, as a Means of Deterrence." This is the title of the report. So there's a consensus today amongst criminologists and amongst within Western legal theory and Western judicial theory and so forth, that prisons do not deter crime, right? Because the severity of prison, the prison term, is not psychologically severe enough to deter the criminal from carrying out that initial crime. Whereas if we, example, look at what some of the Orientalists, Thomas Arnold and so forth, have said about the Islamic track record for deterring theft and whatnot, they will mention that historically very few big acts of theft had taken place in the history of the Islamic society.
There was only one hand cut.
At the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. For example, within 13 years in which the Prophet was in power, which he was the head of state, there was only one incident in which the hand of the thief was cut. And at the time of the four caliphates, which was the first, I believe, 32 years, there were only 4 cases, and so forth. And like I said, even if, for example, like I give the testimony of Ernest Hogg, as well, that the more severe the crime is, the more it deters the crime. So before even understanding, before even asking what are the origins of the Western system or the Islamic system, it's sufficient just to look at the historical track record of both and see that practically the prison system has not deterred crime. As a matter of fact, it just further demoralized and dehumanized the criminal. It created this prison culture.
Just a comment, it's like people always think of, okay, cut out the hands, mutilating physically. This prison mutilating psychologically and emotionally. They go in there, yeah, and they're physically abused within prison. So it's like really.
Because they're all packed in one place and they can do whatever they want.
So if you get your hand cut off and you go back to your family, you still have the emotional and physical and.
So this is for the safety aspect.
This is not to mention, for example, 2/3 of those who are released from prison are sent back to prison. So even as a rehabilitation, and as a matter of fact, they have detrimental effect on the society which they return to before they're sent back to prison.
And is it true that the state is responsible to take care of this person whose hand was cut and his family?
This is a very good point, yes. The Islamic system, the Islamic political system is obligated even after the criminal has carried an act of theft and has had his hand cut to spend and to meet the needs of his and his family. Before and after the crime. And if it came to, for example, the awareness of it was brought to the attention of the judge that the state had not met his needs, who would be punished? Not the criminal, but the governor or the mayor of that district. He would be punished, and not the criminal.
But this idea of taking care of someone who just mutilated is not creating more and more people in the state should be taken care of, because they are in this situation because they have done something against society, against the whole body of the community. So isn't it a bit contradictory in a sense?
No, see, because he forfeited his duty to society, right, he lost his right towards the state, and this is why the punishment was carried out. Because, for example, the state has no right to amputate the hand of the thief or to flog whomever they does not have the right to flog anyone or to cut any hand, right, so long as that person did not forfeit his rights towards the state, right, because it's a system of duty and rights. So because the criminal forfeited his duty towards the state and towards the society, he lost his right to be protected by the state, and therefore the punishment was carried out. And that's one. Two, the criminal, we have to remember that he stole not because out of basic necessity. If the thief stole like a loaf of bread, or stole a certain amount of money to pay his daughter's tuition, or he needed some sort of surgery, if he stole out of necessity, he's not punished, right? So therefore saying that, okay, well, after we cut your hand, we're going to provide your minimal needs, right? This would not be contradictory, because originally he did not steal out of necessity. And had he stolen out of necessity, the punishment would not have been carried out on him. He stole, right, out of greed and out of a psychological motive of increasing his possession despite having his minimal needs met.
I think what you're saying is that after the punishment is carried out, you regain your status as just a subject of the state.
Yeah, of course.
They don't hold a grudge against you. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly as the brother said, that your rights are not forfeited. Right? For example, in the U.S., if you carry out a punishment and you serve a particular prison term, you lose certain rights, correct, up until you die. Whereas in Islam, after the punishment has taken place, not only do you regain your rights with the state, but you are forgiven. God forgives you for the crime which you carried out, right? So you're not punished, obviously, in the hereafter. And this is significant for Muslims, because it's interesting because the times in which the Prophet did carry out capital punishments, it was because Muslims came to him and said, "Oh Prophet, carry out this punishment on me, so that I may be forgiven." You see? So also that's like he says, you regain your rights with the state and you are forgiven by God for committing that sin.
Also, with respect to people in the social surrounding, people don't have the right to speak about what the person has done, or say something bad about it.
Exactly. So, one of the...
Plus, as if it's erased. Isn't the thief?
It's like you have a clean slate. It's like when you actually go to a certain job, you apply to it, and then you have to see record everything you say, I'm sorry, you're in prison or something.
Interestingly, related to this point, in Islam, there's also a particular set of laws which relate to witnesses. So let's say, for example, 3 individuals saw 2 people carrying out sexual intercourse. And they went to the judge and they said, "We are 3 people, we have seen these 2 people carrying out sexual intercourse." Because they did not bring a 4th judge, i.e. they did not bring substantive 4th witness, because they did not bring substantive evidence, they would be punished, all 4 of them.
For slandering.
Exactly, for slandering a particular man or a particular woman. So punishments are also given for false testimonies and for witnesses, false witnesses in the Islamic State. So these 4 people are going to go testify against a woman and a man. They're going to be very certain of what they saw and what they're all going to have to agree upon what they saw and make sure they saw the same thing, i.e. the actual act of penetration, before they go to the judge, because otherwise they're the ones who are going to be punished and they're the ones who are going to be publicly flogged, and not the adulterer and adulteress.
Which is something very hard. How can 4 people see an act of?
Yeah, unless like,
something
yeah.
would happen rarely unless it's in public or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a story also, the judge asked them, did you see them under the blanket or something like that also?
Yes.
SubhanAllah, they have to be very, very accurate in their testimony, or else it's something falsehood, and they're like, it's wrong judgment or something.
Exactly, because if you didn't, SubhanAllah, this is how strict the code is, because if they were under the blanket, no matter what they were doing, you can't be sure that they were carrying out the actual sexual act of intercourse. Therefore, those 4 witnesses would be punished as well, because they did not physically see the act.
So this is making the story so difficult for you to just pinpoint anybody just being out together that there are.
What if you get charged with 9 months later?
This is where ta'zir comes in. This is where the judge can use his discretion to investigate. Like today you have DNA and whatnot, so obviously DNA plays a major role now in modern times. But this is why there's a judicial system in Islam. There's a court. It's not the head of state who carries out the punishment. There's a particular, they have to go to court. There's a judge, there's witnesses, and there's defender and defendant, and obviously someone who is the witness who witnessed the crime, and a prosecutor. So there is a judicial system which you have to go through. It's not just a community which carries out the act. They gather them in the towns, in the center of the city or the center of the town to carry out the act. It's a judge who must designate that this punishment must be carried out. Any more questions? Now we have a live demonstration of that probably. It's one of our younger brothers. He doesn't need to.
No, for example, like the so-called honor killings that's happening nowadays. Under Islamic law, all these people would be killed for killing.
Exactly. These are honor killings are one Islamic, and the punishment for honor killings is death. So the state will put to death anyone who killed his daughter or wife out of because even if the husband saw his wife cheating on him and he killed her, he would be killed for killing her because he did not have 4 witnesses to say, "Oh look, my wife cheated on me." So of course, honor killings, the capital punishment for honor killings in Islam is death. There's even punishments the judge can carry out. If you force your daughter into marriage, the father can be punished for doing so, and so forth. Okay, I'll see you later.
ولكم في القصاص حياة يا أولي الألباب لعلكم تتقون